The journal of his travels forms a large work, in which everything that concerns Persia is especially developed. The long stay he made in the country and his intimate acquaintance with the highest personages of the state enabled him to collect numerous and authentic documents. It may fairly be said that in this way Persia was better known in the 17th century than it was 100 years later. The countries which Chardin had just explored were visited again some years later by a Dutch painter, Cornelius de Bruyn or Le Brun. The great value of his work consists in the beauty and accuracy of the drawings which illustrate it, for as far as the text is concerned, it contains nothing which was not known before, except in what relates to the Samoyeds, whom he was the first to visit. Japanese warrior. Japanese warrior. From an old print. We must now speak of the Westphalian, K. Ampfer, almost a naturalized Swede, in consequence of his long sojourn in Scandinavian countries. He refused the brilliant position which was there offered him in order to accompany as secretary an ambassador who was going to Moscow. He was thus enabled to see the principal cities of Russia, a country which at that period had scarcely entered upon the path of Western civilization. Afterwards, he went to Persia, where he quitted the ambassador Fabricius in order to enter the service of the Dutch Company of the Indies, and to continue his travels. He thus visited in the first place Persepolis, Shiraz, Ormuz upon the Persian Gulf, where he was extremely ill, and whence he embarked in 1688 for the East Indies. Arabia Felix, India, the Malabar coast, Ceylon, Java, Sumatra, and Japan were afterwards all visited by him. The object of these journeys was exclusively scientific. K. Ampfer was a physician, but was more especially devoted to the various branches of natural history, and collected, described, drew, or dried a considerable number of plants then unknown in Europe, gave new information upon their use in medicine or manufactures, and collected an immense herbarium, which is now preserved with the greater part of his manuscripts in the British Museum in London. But the most interesting portion of his narrative, nowadays indeed quite obsolete and very incomplete, since the country has been opened up to our scientific men, was for a long time that relating to Japan. He had contrived to procure books treating of the history, literature, and learning of the country, when he had failed in obtaining from certain personages to whom he had rendered himself very acceptable, information which was not usually imparted to foreigners. To conclude, if all the travelers of whom we have just spoken are not strictly speaking discoverers, if they do not explore countries unknown before, they all have, in various degrees and according to their ability or their studies, the merit of having rendered the countries which they visited better known. Besides, they were able to banish to the domain of fable many of the tales which others less learned had naively accepted, and which had for long become so completely public property that nobody dreamed of disputing them. Thanks to these travelers, something is known of the history of the East. The migrations of nations began to be dimly suspected, and accounts to be given of the changes in those great empires of which the very existence had been long problematical. Chapter 6. 1. The Great Corsair. William Dampier, or a sea king of the 17th century. William Dampier was born in 1612 at East Coker, and by the death of his parents was from his childhood left to his own control. Not possessing any great taste for study, he preferred running wild in the woods and fighting with his companions to remaining in his place on the school benches. While still young, he was sent to sea as cabin boy on board merchant ships. After a voyage to Newfoundland and a campaign in the East Indies, he took service in the naval marine, and being wounded in a battle, returned to Greenwich to be nursed. Free from any prejudices, Dampier forgot his engagement when he left the military hospital and started for Jamaica in the position of manager of a plantation. It did not require a long trial to discover that this occupation was not to his taste. So he abandoned his Negroes at the end of 6 months and went on board a ship bound for the Bay of Kampiki, where he worked for 3 years at gathering in woods for dyeing. At the end of that period, he is again found in London, but the laws and the officers charged with compelling their observance are too strict for his comfort. He goes back to Jamaica, where he speedily puts himself into communication with those famous buccaneers and corsairs, who at that time did so much harm to the Spaniards. These English or French adventurers, established in the island of Tortuga off the coast of San Domingo, had sworn implacable hatred to Spain. Their ravages were not confined to the Gulf of Mexico. They crossed the Isthmus of Panama and devastated the coast of the Pacific Ocean from the Strait of Magellan to California. Terra exaggerated the exploits of these pirates, which however presented something of the marvelous. It was amongst these adventurers, then commanded by Harris, Sawkins, and Shays, that Dampier enrolled himself. In 1680 we find him in Darien, where he pillages Santa Maria, endeavors in vain to surprise Panama, and with his companions on board of some wretched canoes stolen from the Indians, captures 8 vessels well armed, which were at anchor not far from the town. In this affair the losses of the corsairs are so great in the fight, and the spoil is so poor, that they separate from each other. Some go back to the Gulf of Mexico, while others establish themselves upon the island of Juan Fernandez, whence shortly after they attack Arica. But here again they were so roughly handled that a new secession takes place, and Dampier is sent to Virginia, where his captain hoped to make some recruits. Their captain Cook was fitting out a vessel, with the intention of reaching the Pacific by the Strait of Magellan, and Dampier joins the expedition. It begins by privateering upon the African coast, in the Cape de Verde Islands, at Sierra Leone, and in the river Sherbero, for this is the route habitually taken by the ships going to South America. In 36 degrees south latitude, Dampier, who notes in his journal every interesting fact, remarks that the sea is become white or rather pale. But of this he cannot explain the reason, which he might easily have done had he made use of the microscope. The Sebaldine Islands are passed without incident, the Strait of Le Maire is traversed, Cape Horn is doubled on the 6th February, 1684, and as soon as he can escape from the storms which usually assail ships entering the Pacific, Captain Cook arrives at the island of Juan Fernandez, where he hopes to revictual. Dampier wondered if he would find a Nicaraguan Indian there, who had been left behind in 1680 by Captain Sharp. This Indian had remained alone upon the island for more than 3 years. He had been in the woods hunting goats when the English captain had ordered his men to re-embark, and they had set sail without perceiving his absence. He had only his gun and his knife, with a small horn of powder and a little lead. When his powder and lead were exhausted, he had contrived to saw the barrel of his gun into small pieces with his knife, and out of them to make harpoons, spears, fish hooks, and a long knife. With these instruments he obtained all the supplies which the island afforded, goats and fish. At the distance of half a mile from the sea, he had a small hut covered with goat skins. He had no clothes left, but an animal's skin covered his loins. We have dwelt at some length upon this involuntary hermit because he served Daniel Defoe as the original of his Robinson Crusoe, a romance which has formed the delight of every child. We shall not relate minutely all the expeditions in which Dampier participated. Suffice it to mention that in this campaign he visited the Galapagos Islands. In 1686, Dampier was serving on board of Captain Swan's ship, who, seeing that the greater part of his enterprises failed, went to the East Indies, where the Spaniards were less upon their guard, and where the corsairs reckoned upon seizing the Manila galleon. But when our adventurers arrived at Guaham, they had only 3 days' provisions, and the sailors had plotted, if the voyage should be prolonged, to eat in turn all those who had declared themselves in favor of the voyage, and to begin with the captain who had proposed it. Dampier's turn would have come next. Thus it came to pass, says he very humorously, that after having cast anchor at Guaham, Swan embraced him and said, "Ah, Dampier, you would have made them but a sorry meal." He was right, he adds, for I was as thin and lean as he was fat and plump. Mindanao, Manila, certain parts of the Chinese coasts, the Moluccas, New Holland, and the Nicobar Islands were the places visited and plundered by Dampier in this campaign. In the last-named archipelago, he became separated from his companions and was discovered half dead upon the coast of Sumatra. Ah, Dampier, you would have afforded them but a sorry meal. Ah, Dampier, you would have afforded them but a sorry meal. During this voyage, Dampier had discovered several hitherto unknown islands, and especially the Basque group. Like the thorough adventurer he was, immediately he recovered his health, he traveled over the south of Asia, Malacca, Tonkin, Madras, and Bencoolen, where he enrolled himself as an artilleryman in the English service. 5 months afterwards, he deserted and returned to London. The narrative of his adventures and his privateering obtained for him a certain amount of sympathy amongst the higher classes, and he was presented to the Earl of Oxford, Lord High Admiral. He speedily received the command of the ship Roebuck to attempt a voyage of discovery in the seas which he had already explored. He left England on the 14th January, 1699, with the intention of passing through the Strait of Magellan or of making the tour of Tierra del Fuego so as to commence his discoveries on the coasts of the Pacific, which had hitherto received the visits of a comparatively small number of travelers. After crossing the line on the 10th March, he sailed for Brazil, where the ship was revictualled. Far from being able again to descend the coast of Patagonia, he beheld himself driven by the wind to 48 miles south of the Cape of Good Hope, whence he steered east-southeast towards New Holland, a long passage which was not signalized by any adventure. On the 1st August, Dampier saw land and at once sought for a harbor in which to land. 5 days later, he entered the Bay of Sea Dogs upon the western coast of Australia, but he only found there a sterile soil and met with neither water nor vegetation. Until the 31st August, he sailed along this coast without discovering what he sought. Once when he landed, he had a slight skirmish with some of the inhabitants, who seemed to be very thinly scattered over the country. Their chief was a young man of middle height, but quick and vigilant. His eyes were surrounded by a single ring of white paint, while a stripe of the same color descended from the top of his forehead to the end of his nose. His chest and arms were likewise striped with white. His companions were black, fierce in aspect, their hair woolly, and in shape they were tall and slender. For 5 weeks Dampier hovered near land, and found neither water nor provisions. However, he would not give in, and intended to continue to ascend the coast northwards, but the shallows which he incessantly encountered, and the monsoon from the northwest, which was soon due, obliged him to give up the enterprise, after having discovered more than 900 miles of the Australian continent. He afterwards steered towards Timor, where he intended to repose and recruit his crew, exhausted by the long voyage. But he knew little of these parts, and his charts were quite insufficient. He was therefore obliged to make a reconnaissance of it, as if the Dutch had not already been long settled there. Thus, he discovered a passage between Timor and Anamabo, in a locality in which his map only indicated a bay. The arrival of Dampier in a port known only to themselves astonished and greatly displeased the Dutch. They imagined that the English could only have reached it by means of charts taken on board a ship of their own. However, in the end, they recovered from their fright and received the strangers with kindness. Although the precursors of the monsoon were making themselves felt, Dampier again put to sea and steered towards the western coast of New Guinea, where he arrived on the 4th February, 1700, near to Cape Maho of the Dutch. Amongst the things which struck him, Dampier notices the prodigious quantities of a species of pigeon, bats of extraordinary size, and scallops, a kind of shellfish, of which the empty shell weighed as much as 258 pounds. On the 7th of February, he approaches King William's Island and runs to the east, where he soon sights the Cape of Good Hope of Schouten and the island named after that navigator. On the 24th, the crew witnessed a curious spectacle. 2 fish, which had accompanied the vessel for 5 or 6 days, perceived a great sea serpent and began to pursue it. They were about the shape and size of mackerel, but yellow and green in color. The serpent, who fled from them with great swiftness, carried his head out of the water, and one of them attempted to seize his tail. As soon as he turned round, the first fish remained in the rear, and the other took his place. They retained their wind for a long time, always heedful to defend themselves by flight, until they were lost to view. On the 25th, Dampier gave the name of St. Matthias to a mountainous island, 30 miles long, situated above and to the east of the Admiralty Islands. Further on, at the distance of 21 or 24 miles, he discovered another island, which received the name of Squally Island, on account of violent whirlwinds, which prevented him from landing upon it. Dampier believed himself to be on the coast of New Guinea, while he was in reality sailing along that of New Ireland. He endeavored to land there, but he was surrounded by canoes carrying more than 200 natives, and the shore was covered by a large crowd. Seeing that it would be imprudent to send a boat on shore, Dampier ordered the ship to be put about. Scarcely was the order given, when the ship was assailed by showers of stones, which the natives hurled from a machine of which Dampier could not discover the shape, but which caused the name of Slingers Bay to be given to this locality. A single discharge of cannon stupefied the natives and put an end to hostilities. A little further on, at some distance from the coast of New Ireland, the English discover the islands of Denny's and St. John. Dampier is the first to pass through the strait which separates New Ireland from New Britain, and discovers Vulcan, Crown, G. Rook, Long Reach, and Burning Islands. Battle in Slingers Bay. Battle in Slingers Bay. After this long cruise, distinguished by important discoveries, Dampier again steered towards the west, reached Misery Island, and at length arrived at the island of Ceram, one of the Moluccas, where he made a somewhat long stay. He went afterwards to Borneo, passed through the Strait of Macassar, and on the 23rd of June anchored at Batavia in the island of Java. He remained there until the 17th of October, when he set out for Europe. On arriving at the island of Ascension on the 23rd of February, 1701, his vessel had so considerable a leak that it was impossible to stop it. It was necessary to run the ship aground and to put the crew and cargo on shore. Happily, there was no want of water, turtles, goats, and land crabs, which prevented any fear of dying of hunger before some ship should call at the island and transport the shipwrecked sailors to their country. For this, they had not long to wait, for on the 2nd of April, an English vessel took them on board and carried them to England. We shall have occasion again to speak of Dampier with relation to the voyages of Wood Rogers. Chapter 2. The Pole and America. Hudson and Baffin, Champlain and La Salle, the English upon the coast of the Atlantic, the Spaniards in South America. Summary of the information acquired at the close of the 17th century, the measure of the terrestrial degree, progress of cartography, inauguration of mathematical geography. Although the attempts to find a passage by the northwest had been abandoned by the English for 20 years, they had not, however, given up the idea of seeking by that way for a passage which was only to be discovered in our own days, and of which the absolute impracticability was then to be ascertained. A clever sailor, Henry Hudson, of whom Ellis says that never did anyone better understand the seafaring profession, that his courage was equal to any emergency, and that his application was indefatigable, concluded an agreement with a company of merchants to search for the passage by the northwest. On the 1st of May, 1607, he sailed from Gravesend in the Hopewell, a craft about the size of one of the smallest of modern collier brigs, and having on board a crew of 12 men, and on the 13th of June reached the eastern coast of Greenland at 73 degrees, and gave it a name answering to the hopes he entertained, in calling it Cape Hold with Hope. The weather here was finer and less cold than it had been 10 degrees southwards. By the 27th of June, Hudson had advanced degrees more to the north, but on the 2nd of July, by one of the sudden changes which so frequently occur in those countries, the cold became severe. The sea, however, remained free, the air was still, and driftwood floated about in large quantity. On the 14th of the same month, in 33 degrees 23, the master's mate and the boatswain of the vessel landed upon a shore which formed the northern part of Spitzbergen. Traces of musk oxen and foxes, great abundance of aquatic birds, 2 streams of fresh water, one of them being warm, proved to our navigators that it was possible to live in these extreme latitudes at this period of the year. Hudson, who had re-embarked without delay, found himself arrested at the height of 82 degrees by thick pack ice, which he endeavored in vain to penetrate or sail round. He was compelled to return to England, where he arrived on September 15th, after having discovered an island, which is probably that of Jan Mayen. The route followed in this first voyage having had no result towards the north, Hudson would try another, and accordingly set sail on Amidst in the following year, and advanced between Spitzbergen and Nova Zembla. But he could only follow for a certain distance the coast of that vast land, without being able to attain as high an elevation as he had wished. The failure of this second attempt was more complete than that of the voyage of 1607, In consequence, the English company, which had defrayed the expenses of both attempts, declined to proceed further. This was doubtless the reason which decided Hudson to take service in Holland. The Company of Amsterdam gave him, in 1609, the command of a vessel, with which he set sail from the Texel at the beginning of the year. Having doubled the North Cape, he advanced along the coasts of Nova Zembla, but his crew, composed of English and Dutch, who had made voyages to the East Indies, were soon disheartened by the cold and ice. Hudson found himself forced to change his route, and to propose to his sailors, who were in open mutiny, to seek for a passage either by Davis Strait or the coasts of Virginia, where, according to the information of Captain Smith, who had frequently visited them, an outlet must surely be found. The choice of this crew, little accustomed to discipline, could not be doubtful. In order not to render the outlay of the company completely abortive, Hudson was obliged to make for the Faroe Islands, to descend southward as low as 44 degrees, and to search on the coast of America for the strait, of the existence of which he had been assured. On July 18th, he disembarked on the continent in order to replace his foremast, which had been broken in a storm, and he took the opportunity of bartering furs with the natives. But his undisciplined sailors, having by their exactions roused the indignation of the poor and peaceable natives, compelled him again to set sail. He continued to follow the coast until August 3rd, and then landed a second time. At 40 degrees 30, he discovered a great bay which he explored in a canoe for more than 150 miles. In the meantime, his provisions began to run short, and it was impossible to procure supplies on land. The crew, which appears to have imposed its wishes on its captain during this whole voyage, assembled. Some proposed to winter in Newfoundland in order to resume the search for the passage in the following year. Others wished to make for Ireland. This latter proposition was adopted, but when they approached the shores of Great Britain, the land proved so attractive to his men that Hudson was obliged, on November 7th, to cast anchor at Dartmouth. The following year, 1610, notwithstanding all the mortifications which he had experienced, Hudson tried to renew his engagement with the Dutch company, but the terms which they named as the price of their concurrence compelled him to renounce the project and induced him to submit to the requirements of the English company. This company imposed on Hudson as a condition that he should carry on board, rather as an assistant than as a subordinate, a clever seaman named Colburn, in whom they had full confidence. It is easy to understand how mortifying this condition was to Hudson. Accordingly, he took the earliest opportunity of ridding himself of the superintendent who had been imposed upon him. He had not yet left the Thames when he sent Colburn back to shore with a letter for the company, in which he endeavored to palliate and justify this certainly very strange proceeding. Towards the end of May, when the ship had cast anchor in one of the ports of the island, the crew formed on the subject of Colburn its first conspiracy, which was repressed without difficulty, and when Hudson quitted the island on June 1st, he had re-established his authority. After having passed Frobisher's Strait, he sighted the land of desolation of Davis, entered the strait which has received his name, and speedily penetrated into a wide bay, the entire western coast of which he examined until the beginning of September. At this epoch, one of the inferior officers, continuing to excite revolt against his chief, was superseded, but this act of justice only exasperated the sailors. In the early part of November, Hudson, having arrived at the extremity of the bay, sought for an appropriate spot to winter in, and having soon found one, drew up the ship on dry land. It is difficult to understand such a resolution. On the one hand, Hudson had left England with provisions for 6 months only, which had already been largely reduced, and he could scarcely reckon, considering the barrenness of the country, upon procuring a further supply of nourishment. On the other, the crew had exhibited such numerous signs of mutiny that he could hardly rely upon its discipline and goodwill. Nevertheless, although the English were often obliged to content themselves with scanty rations, they did not, owing to the arrival of great numbers of birds, pass a very distressing winter. But on the return of spring, as soon as the ship was prepared to resume her route to England, Hudson found that his fate was decided. He made his arrangements accordingly, distributed to each his share of biscuit, paid the wages due, and awaited the course of events. He had not long to wait. The conspirators seized their captain, his son, a volunteer, the carpenter, and 5 sailors, put them on board a boat, without arms, provisions, or instruments, and abandoned them to the mercy of the ocean. The culprits reached England again, but not all. 2 were killed in an encounter with the Indians, another died of sickness, while the others were sorely tried by famine. Eventually, no prosecution was commenced against them. Only the company, in 1674, procured employment on board a vessel for the son of Henry Hudson, lost in the discovery of the Northwest, the son being entirely destitute of resources. Hudson abandoned by his crew. Hudson abandoned by his crew. The expeditions of Hudson were followed by those of Burton and of Gibbons, to whom we owe, if not new discoveries, important observations on the tides, the variation of the weather and the temperature, and on a number of natural phenomena. In 1615, the English company entrusted to Byleth, who had taken part in the last voyages, the command of a vessel of 50 tons. Her name, the Discovery, was of good augury. She carried as pilot the famous William Baffin, whose renown has eclipsed that of his captain. Setting sail from England on Apeth, the English explorers sighted Cape Farewell by the 6th of May, passed from the Island of Desolation to the Savage Islands, where they met with a great number of natives, and ascended northwestward as high as 64 degrees. On July 10th, land appeared on the starboard, and the tide flowed from the north, from which they conceived so much hope of the passage sought for that they gave to the cape, discovered on this spot, the name of Comfort. It was probably Cape Walsingham, for they ascertained, after doubling it, that the land inclined towards the northeast and the east. It was at the entry of Davis Strait that their discoveries came to an end for this year. They returned to Plymouth on September 9th without having lost a single man. So strong were the hopes entertained by Byleth and Baffin that they obtained permission to put to sea again in the same vessel the following year. On May 14th, 1616, after a voyage in which nothing worthy of remark occurred, the 2 captains penetrated into Davis Strait, sighted Cape Henderson's Hope, the extreme point formerly reached by Davis, and ascended as high as 72 degrees 40 to the Women's Island, thus named after some Esquimaux females whom they met with. On June 12th, Byleth and Baffin were forced by the ice to enter a bay on the coast. Some Esquimaux brought them a great quantity of horns, without doubt tusks of walruses or horns of musk oxen, from which they named the Bay Horn Sound. After remaining some days in this place, they were able to put to sea again. On setting out fro degrees 40, they encountered a vast expanse of water free from ice, and penetrated, without much danger, beyond the 78 degrees of latitude, to the entrance of the strait, which prolonged northwards the immense bay which they had just traversed, and which received the name of Baffin. Then turning to the west, and afterwards to the southwest, Byleth and Baffin discovered the Carey Islands, Jones Strait, Coburg Island, and Lancaster Strait, and afterwards they descended along the entire western shore of Baffin's Bay as far as Cumberland Land. Despairing then of being able to carry his discoveries further, Byleth, who had several men among his crew afflicted with scurvy, found himself obliged to return to the shores of England, where he disembarked at Dover on August 30th. If this expedition terminated again in failure, in the sense that the Northwest Passage was not discovered, the results obtained were nevertheless considerable. Byleth and Baffin had prodigiously increased the knowledge of the seas and coasts in the quarters of Greenland. The captain and the pilot, in writing to the director of the company, assured him that the bay which they had visited was an excellent spot for fishing, in which thousands of whales, seals, and walruses disported themselves. The event could not be long in amply proving the correctness of this information. Let us now descend again upon the coast of America as far as Canada and see what had happened since the time of Jacques Cartier. This latter, we may remember, had made an attempt at colonization, which had not produced any important results. Nevertheless, some Frenchmen had remained in the country, had married there, and founded families of colonists. From time to time, they received reinforcements brought by fishing vessels from Dieppe or St. Malo, but it was difficult to establish a current of emigration. It was under these circumstances that a gentleman, named Samuel de Champlain, a veteran of the wars of Henry Roman IV, and who, for 2 years and a half, had frequented the East Indies, was engaged by the commander of chastes with the Sieur de Pontgrave to continue the discoveries of Jacques Cartier and to choose the situations most favorable for the establishment of towns and centers of population. This is not the place for us to consider the manner in which Champlain understood the business of a colonizer, nor his great services, which might well entitle him to be called the Father of Canada. We will, therefore, advisedly leave this aspect of his undertaking, not the least brilliant, in order simply to occupy ourselves with the discoveries which he effected in the interior of the continent. Setting sail from Honfleur on March 15, 1603, the two chiefs of the enterprise first ascended the St. Lawrence as far as the harbor of Tadoussac, 240 miles from its mouth. They were welcomed by the populations, which had, however, neither faith nor law and lived without God and without religion like brute beasts. At this place they quitted their ships, which could not have advanced further without danger, and reached in a boat the fall of St. Louis, where Jacques Cartier had been stopped. They even penetrated a little into the interior, and then returned to France, where Champlain printed a narrative of the voyage for the king. Henry Roman IV resolved to continue the enterprise. In the meantime, M. de Chastes having died, his privilege was transferred to M. de Monts, with the title of Vice-Admiral and Governor of Acadia. Champlain accompanied M. de Monts to Canada and passed 3 whole years, whether in aiding by his counsels and his exertions the efforts of colonization, or in exploring the coasts of Acadia, the bearings of which he took beyond Cape Cod, or in making excursions into the interior and visiting the savage tribes, which it was important to conciliate. In 1607, after a new voyage to France to recruit colonists, Champlain returned again to New France and founded, in 1608, a town which was to become Quebec. The following year was devoted to again ascending the St. Lawrence and ascertaining its course. On board of a pirogue, with 2 companions only, Champlain penetrated, with some Algonquins, to the Iroquois and remained conqueror in a great battle fought on the borders of a lake which has received his name. He then descended the river Richelieu as far as the St. Lawrence. In 1610, he made a fresh incursion into the territory of the Iroquois at the head of his allies, the Algonquins, whom he had the greatest possible difficulty in making observe the European discipline. In this campaign, he employed instruments of warfare which greatly astonished the savages and easily secured him the victory. For the attack of a village, he constructed a cavalier of wood, which 200 of the most powerful men carried before this village to within a pike's length, and displayed 3 arquebusiers well protected from the arrows and stones which might be shot or launched at them. A little later, we see him exploring the river Ottawa and advancing in the north of the continent to within 225 miles of Hudson's Bay. After having fortified Montreal in 1615, he twice ascended the Ottawa, explored Lake Huron, and arrived by land at Lake Ontario, which he crossed. Siege of a Village by Champlain. Siege of a Village by Champlain. It is very difficult to divide into 2 parts a life so occupied as Champlain's. All his excursions, all his reconnaissances, had but one object, the development of the work to which he had consecrated his existence. Thus detached from what gives them their interest, they appear to us unimportant, and yet if the colonial policy of Louis Roman XIV and his successor had been different, we should possess in America a colony which assuredly would not yield in prosperity to the United States. Notwithstanding our abandonment, Canada has preserved a fervent love for the mother country. We must now leap over a period of 40 years to arrive at Robert Cavelier de la Salle. During this time, the French establishments have acquired some importance in Canada and have extended themselves over a great part of North America. Our hunters and trappers scour the woods and bring, every year, with their load of furs, new information respecting the interior of the continent. In this latter task, they are powerfully seconded by the missionaries, in the first rank of whom we must place Father Marquette, whom the extent of his voyages on the Great Lakes and as far as the Mississippi marks out for special acknowledgement. 2 men, besides, deserve to be mentioned for the encouragements and facilities which they afforded to the explorers, viz., M. de Frontenac governor of New France, and Talon, intendant of justice and police. In 1678, there arrived in Canada, without any settled purpose, a young man named Cavalier de la Salle. He was born at Rouen, says Father Charlevoix, of a family in easy circumstances, but having passed some years with the Jesuits, he had no share in the inheritance of his parents. He had a cultivated mind, he wished to distinguish himself, and he felt within himself sufficient genius and courage to ensure success. In reality, he was not deficient in resolution to enter upon, nor in perseverance to follow up, an undertaking, nor in firmness in contending against obstacles, nor in resource to repair his losses. But he knew not how to make himself loved, nor how to manage those of whom he stood in need, and when he had attained authority, he exercised it with harshness and arrogance. With such defects he could not be happy, and in fact he was not. Father Charlevoix's portrait appears to us somewhat too black, and he does not seem to estimate at its true value the great discovery which we owe to Cavalier de la Salle. A discovery which has nothing like it, we do not say equal to it, except that of the river Amazon by Orellana in the 16th century, and that of the Congo by Stanley in the 19th. However this may be, no sooner had he arrived in the country than he set himself, with extraordinary application, to study the native idioms and to associate with the savages in order to render himself familiar with their manners and habits. At the same time, he gathered from the trappers a mass of information on the situation of the rivers and lakes. He communicated his projects of exploration to M. de Frontenac, who encouraged him and gave him the command of a fort constructed at the outlet of the lake into the St. Lawrence. In the meantime, one Joliet arrived at Quebec. He brought the news that in company with Father Marquette and 4 other persons, he had reached a great river called the Mississippi, flowing towards the south. Cavalier de la Salle very soon understood what advantage might be derived from an artery of this importance, especially if the Mississippi had, as he believed, its mouth in the Gulf of Mexico. By the lakes and the Illinois, an affluent of the Mississippi, it was easy to effect a communication between the St. Lawrence and the Sea of the Antilles. What marvelous profit would France derive from this discovery? La Salle explained the project which he had conceived to the Count of Frontenac, and obtained from him very pressing letters of recommendation to the Minister of Marine. On arriving in France, La Salle learned the death of Colbert, but he remitted to his son, the Marquis of Seignelay, who had succeeded him, the dispatches of which he was the bearer. This project, which appeared to rest upon solid foundations, could not fail to please a young minister. Accordingly, Seignelay presented La Salle to the king, who caused letters of nobility to be prepared for him, granted him the seigneury of Cataraqui and the government of the fort which he had built, with the monopoly of commerce in the countries which he might discover. La Salle had also found means to procure the patronage of the Prince de Conti, who asked him to take with him the Chevalier Tonty, son of the inventor of the tontine, in whom he felt an interest. He was for La Salle a precious acquisition. Tonty, who had made a campaign in Sicily, where his hand had been carried off by the explosion of a grenade, was a brave and skillful officer, who always showed himself extremely devoted. La Salle and Tonty embarked at Rochelle on July 14, 1678, carrying with them about 30 men, workmen and soldiers, and a Recollet monk, Father Hennepin, who accompanied them in all their voyages. Then La Salle, being conscious that the execution of his project required more considerable resources than those which were at his disposal, constructed a boat upon the Lake Erie, and devoted a whole year to scouring the country, visiting the Indians, and carrying on an active trade in furs, which he stored in his fort of Niagara, while Tonty pursued the same course in other directions. At length, towards the middle of August of the year 1679, his boat, the Griffin, being prepared for sailing, he embarked on the Lake Erie with 30 men and 3 fathers Recollets for Mackillimickinac. In crossing the Lake St. Clair and Huron, he experienced a violent storm, which caused the desertion of some of his people, whom, however, Tonty brought back to him. La Salle arrived at Mackillimickinac and very soon entered the Green Bay. But during this time, his creditors at Quebec had sold all that he possessed, and the Griffin, which he had dispatched, laden with furs, to the fort of Niagara, was either lost or pillaged by the Indians. Which of these took place has never been precisely ascertained. For himself, although the departure of the Griffin had displeased his companions, he continued his route and reached the river St. Joseph, where he found an encampment of Miamis and where Tonti speedily rejoined him. Their first care was to construct a fort on this spot. Then they crossed the dividing line of the water between the basin of the Great Lakes and that of the Mississippi. They subsequently reached the river of the Illinois, an affluent on the left of that great river. With his small band of followers, upon whose fidelity he could not entirely depend, the situation of La Salle was critical in the midst of an unknown country, and among a powerful nation, the Illinois, who, at first allies of France, had been prejudiced and excited against us by the Iroquois and the English, jealous of the progress of the Canadian colony.